Hey there, gamer peeps! Welcome back to the Devlog for Feast of Fiends. Before any of the 5 of you watching inform me, yes, if you look at the upload schedule, I skipped last week. I was in a cabin in the woods and I didn't make a ton of progress. So kill me. No, not that kind of cabin in the woods. If it was, the world would have ended. Still, I'm trying hard not to have any 0% days, as David Wheely talks about on his channel Game Dev Unlocked. Put simply, do a little of something every day, and every day you move closer to your goal. It's a simple concept, at least in theory, but it's hard in practice. Stupid design elegance. Why can't things that are worth doing be easy in both theory and mastery? It's like life is a game or something. Anywho, I spent that time in the cabin making questionable decisions, mostly about what modeling program I was going to use. I decided on Blender. Like the genius I am, I decided while struggling to complete what could possibly turn out to be the most challenging projects I've ever made, I should also teach myself a whole new program for modeling. The first super simple model I started with was a knife block. It's the place where you get and you place your knives. Normally, this maybe 50 poly model would take me 15 minutes to do. Having a very limited understanding of Blender, though, it made it a much longer ordeal. Being a pro, I had no issues at all. Yep, everything is smooth sailing. Next, I modeled a knife. Eventually I'll need a whole bunch of these, but at this point, one low poly pointy boy will be enough for my purposes. And between learning how to move the pivot points and the process of assigning materials in Blender, I felt accomplished at least. I also added in a countertop mesh. This mesh was my modular scale test. I made it basically a 100 centimeter cube so that I could snap it around. Since Unreal units equal centimeters and I can snap on a 50 unit spacing, this almost 3-foot box is the basic scale unit for most aspects of the game. With these objects modeled, it was time to go back into the mechanics. I'm about to get into the nitty-gritty of it all, so artists, you can tune out for a bit. Programmers? I'm sorry. I'm sure my inefficiency is about to give you a massive headache. And designers? Well, here's how I'm making my game. The secrets are all gonna be out. All I ask is that if you do see something you'd like to rip off, just make sure you hit that like button for me. Firstly, I had a bug to fix. Objects on the counter couldn't be picked up. Seemed that the box trace would first hit the counter and only register that hit, never seeing the item I wanted to pick up off of the counter. But I would also need to recognize if the counter was being seen to be able to put an item on top of it. My first thought was to shrink the box trace so it would sweep over top of the counter, and then have another trace search for the counters separately. The reason for this was the counter was a static mesh, so telling the trace to ignore actors wouldn't work. The immediate issue with this method was my item trace, when set high enough to go over the top of the counters, it went right over top of any item that was on the ground. I would have to keep the box trace large enough to see items both on the ground and on the counters. Changing the trace type to trace for object, I was able to assign a query for the counter to be world static, and then the items to be world dynamic. Now my box trace wouldn't read the counter and only the items. Yet, you know what? If that doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry. It was all a wasted effort. I wound up realizing that I would want the counter to be an actor anyway, so I could store the placement location on top of the counter relative to each counter actor. Eventually, I'll also add a variable inside of the counter to check to see if the countertop has an item on it. All of this meaning I went back to the trace by channel, and just told the trace to ignore all of the counter actors. Then I created a duplicate trace that searches for the counters. Success! Kind of. I realize this is a bit of a hacky solution. I have 2 identical traces running on the player tick, with potentially 4 players at a time running around. It would seem a multi-box trace by channel would do the job better, but I just can't get it to work. I tried. If anyone knows how to use a multi-trace in a way that it can see many items, but only read the first item it sees, and then also read the counter if the counter is valid, Please, be my guest in explaining that to me because I don't get it. Next up, I set up the picking up of the knife. For the most part, I could just repurpose the code from the item pickup. Which also means to me, I may have to revisit what I have and see if it wouldn't be more efficient to have the items and knives stored in the same variable. But that will be a struggle for future me to figure out. Part of the reason I have the two as separate actors and therefore variables is because I don't want players to be able to place the knives onto the counter the same ways as the items. Knives will come out of and go into the knife block. Knives will also allow the player to chop by pressing the action button. That's something an item won't allow. Yes, this could all be checked from a pure cast boolean, but there will be a lot of other data separating the actors, and I'm just not yet sure what's going to be most efficient. Most people aren't going to be concerned with the sweetness of their knives or the sharpness of their tomatoes. Nonetheless, either way, I wind up with a bunch of spaghetti. You've always got to make a bit of time for some cleanup. That all done, the last thing I wanted to do was get the throwing mechanic working, or at least started. Trying to keep the gameplay mechanics simple, back to that whole elegance of design thing, I decided tapping the B or reject button to drop an item would drop it, but that same button was held down, the player enters into a throwing state. Then, when the button is released, based on the player direction, the item would be thrown. In many ways, programming this went surprisingly smoothly. Incrementing a variable on a loop, all I had to do was check the value of the variable, and when it reached a certain point, stop the loop and enter the throw state. Then, on the button release, the knife would now travel to a thrown location, and when at that location, it would stop moving and once again enable physics. Adding a few variables in the movement loop to rotate the item as it's being thrown, and adding a pause before the physics kicked back in, I made it look better, and also I had consistent results. I added a check for the throw state and the movement function of the player character, and stopped updating location, only updating rotation when an item was being thrown. And really, once I did all of that, it wrapped up about 2 weeks worth of work. Next on my long list of things to do, I plan on focusing on arting things up a bit more. I want to get this starting to look like an actual kitchen, an actual environment a little bit more, which means I need to get tiles on the floor, materials on the counter, probably an actual level to design. I need to add in a stove. I need to model and animate the player characters, which I've never done in Blender. Yay me. Not to mention all of the ingredients need models. I should get a couple of them at least blocked out, all in a modeling program I'm really not familiar with. I'm not overwhelmed. I'm just unbearably concerned about how much lies ahead. Totally different. I just have to take it one step at a time. If you'd like, subscribe and stay tuned for the inevitable mental breakdown that is sure to come. Be sure to comment all of your opinions on my spiral into madness and all of those other YouTube necessities. As always, this has been Broccoli G 515, your least favorite vegetable. And I'm thanking you so much for watching this devlog for Feast of Fiends. Let me know if you're working on any things yourselves. I'd love to follow your progress. And until next time, get out there and create something.